Welcome, friends, to a heartwarming tale of unexpected twists, family bonds, and the power of second chances in love. Enjoy the story. Emily gently closed the bedroom door, her heart aching for her husband. Lately, Mark had been so exhausted that he was falling asleep on his feet. Today was no exception. He had rushed home from work, wolfed down a plate of mac and cheese, and collapsed on the couch. His last words before drifting off were, "Em, wake me up in an hour, I need to go see Dad." Emily sighed, remembering their brief exchange. "Again? You were just there the day before yesterday." But Mark was already fast asleep, oblivious to her words. She quietly closed the door and made her way to the kitchen, her mind racing. Something has to change, she thought, absently stirring her cooling cup of tea. Frank may not be the easiest person to deal with, but he's elderly and can't take care of himself anymore. We'll have to bring him here. Emily shuddered involuntarily as memories of past arguments with her father-in-law flooded her mind. People always said that daughters-in-law had a hard time with mothers-in-law, but in their case, there was no mother-in-law, just Frank, who seemed to embody the worst qualities of both in-laws combined. When Emily first married Mark, she had tried her best to get along with Frank. They had even moved in with him in his suburban house, or humble abode as he pompously called it. The commute to work had been a nightmare. Mark had a car, not new but reliable. The problem was that they worked on opposite sides of the city. They had worked out a system. One week, Mark would drop Emily at the bus stop on his way to work, and the next week, Emily would drop Mark off. It seemed fair to them, but Frank hated it. He believed that Emily wasn't important enough to warrant such consideration. "She can walk or take the bus," he'd mutter loud enough for her to hear. "She's not some princess." Emily had overheard Frank lecturing Mark more than once. "Why are you letting her lead you around by the nose? She needs to know her place." Mark would brush him off. "Dad, don't be ridiculous." But Frank was relentless. Things came to a head when Frank started berating Emily directly, telling her she wasn't a princess and shouldn't be making such demands on his son. Emily and Mark had married in their late 20s. Emily had a failed marriage behind her, and Mark had his father. Maybe if she had been younger, Emily might have kept quiet. But she wasn't about to let this slide. She gave Frank a piece of her mind. She didn't yell or insult him, but she made it clear how his behavior looked from the outside and that she and Mark could manage their own relationship without his input. "Frank," she had said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger, "I understand you care about Mark, but we're adults. We can make our own decisions about our lives and our marriage." Frank's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own house?" he had bellowed. Mark, get down here and control your wife." Mark, who had already gone to bed, came running at the sound of raised voices. He managed to calm his father down, then came to the kitchen, his head hanging low. "Em, I get how hard this is for you," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I feel bad about leaving Dad alone, but if we don't move out, our marriage is done for. I'll start looking for a place to rent." Emily didn't argue. She knew it was because of her, but she couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I never meant to come between you and your father." Mark squeezed her hand. "It's not your fault, Em. Dad, he's set in his ways. Maybe some distance will do us all good." The first 2 years after moving out were blissful. Frank only called Mark, and he visited them just a couple of times. Mark would go see him on weekends to help out. Emily forced herself to go along a few times, cleaning and doing laundry. They barely spoke to each other, which was probably for the best. Any conversation would likely have ended in an argument. But in the past year, things had taken a turn. Emily and Mark had just taken out a mortgage. They had scraped together enough for the down payment, and even had a little left over for renovations. They had opted for a 2-bedroom apartment with plans for a baby in the near future. "Can you believe it, Em?" Mark had said, twirling her around their new living room. "Our own place, room for a family. It's perfect." Emily had laughed, feeling truly happy for the first time in years. "It is perfect. You're perfect." Then Frank fell ill, seriously ill. Mark was constantly ferrying him to doctor appointments, but the physicians seemed at a loss. Mark was devastated, realizing his father wasn't getting any younger. He spent every free moment with Frank, but Mark also worked long hours, so he couldn't be there as often as he'd like. Today, something had apparently broken down at Frank's place, so Mark had rushed home early, planning to catch a quick nap before heading over. Emily peeked into the bedroom. Mark was still sound asleep, in exactly the same position he'd fallen into. She closed the door and decisively grabbed the car keys. Let him rest. She would go over, deliver some groceries, tidy up whatever needed doing. As Emily navigated the busy streets, her mind raced with self-recrimination. I shouldn't be acting like this, she thought. Frank is Mark's only living relative. I need to suck it up and even apologize to him. The small town where Frank lived was only about 10 miles from the city. It had its own character local shops, a different vibe, different people. As Emily turned onto the main street, she had to slam on the brakes. A tipsy man and woman had practically fallen into the road right in front of her car. Heart pounding, Emily rolled down her window. What are you doing? You could have been killed. The man waved dismissively, not even glancing in her direction. Their grocery bag clinked merrily with bottles. Emily snorted. Of course, they're off to have a good time, while I'm here with my guilt trip. She noticed that despite their inebriated state, the couple was actually quite well dressed. Not homeless or chronic alcoholics, just people out for a good time. As Emily continued driving, dusk was falling. She'd have to drive back in the dark. When she was almost at Frank's house, a terrible thought struck her. Mark had said his father was in bad shape, barely able to get out of bed or do anything for himself. Mark had been buying vitamins, salmon, and medications by the truckload. Emily had never objected. Frank was family, after all. But now, a horrifying scenario played out in her mind. What if she walked in and found Frank gone? Emily was terrified of dead bodies, and the whole situation would be awful. She shook off these morbid thoughts and turned the last corner. Then she slammed on the brakes again. Frank's house was lit up like a Christmas tree. At first, she was alarmed, but then she saw the same couple from earlier turning into Frank's driveway. What on earth are they doing at a sick old man's house? Emily muttered, jumping out of the car and running after them. As she entered the yard, she realized what had been bothering her subconsciously. Music. Frank lived a bit isolated, and Emily could clearly hear a melody that couldn't be coming from anywhere but Frank's house. That's when she saw it, a party in full swing in Frank's backyard. People were dancing, laughing, and chatting animatedly. The smell of grilled food wafted through the air. Hey, don't just stand there. Come on in, don't be shy. A voice behind her made Emily jump. She turned to find a man in his 60s, clearly tipsy but very friendly. Emily stammered, completely at a loss for words. The man peered at her more closely. Huh, Frank must be losing it. You're way too young for him. Is your name Natalie? No, it's Emily, she managed to reply. Emily, huh? Well, doesn't matter. Come on in. He gestured expansively towards the party. Emily took a hesitant step forward, completely baffled by the situation. She wanted to ask the man who had invited her what was going on, but he was already twirling some woman in a dance. Emily froze as she caught sight of Frank. He looked nothing like a dying man. Frank was standing by a grill, a glass in one hand, expertly flipping skewers with the other. He was laughing and joking with a group of people around him. Emily was at a total loss. Suddenly, someone gently took her by the elbow. She turned to find a woman in her 60s smiling at her. The stranger radiated warmth and kindness. You must be Emily, right? The woman asked. Emily nodded mutely. Frank showed me your pictures, the woman continued, her eyes twinkling. I'm Natalie, by the way. Frank? Emily echoed, more confused than ever. Your father-in-law, Natalie clarified. Come on, Frank will be so happy to see you. We're celebrating a little something today. Celebrating? Emily felt like a broken record. Wait, I don't understand. Why would you think he'd be happy to see me? Natalie's smile softened. Because you all haven't visited him in so long. He said you were upset with him, and rightly so, he didn't behave well. Emily's mind was in complete disarray. What do you mean haven't visited in a long time? Mark is here almost every day. She hardly noticed Natalie leading her to the table where Frank was holding court. Emily? Frank's surprised voice cut through her confusion. Emily, how did you get here? Is something wrong with Mark? No, Mark is fine, Emily managed to say. Well, except for being exhausted from coming to see you every day. I decided to come myself today. To see me? Every day? Frank looked genuinely puzzled. Emily's mind was starting to clear, and now she wanted nothing more than to burst into tears. The disconnect between what she thought she knew and what she was seeing was overwhelming. Sit down, Emily, Frank said, his tone gentler than she'd ever heard it. I'm not letting you drive back in the dark. Natalie and I are celebrating our engagement today. Well, I suppose that's what you'd call it. Let's sit, talk, have a drink to our health. Emily obediently took a glass. At this point, she was willing to do just about anything to make sense of this bizarre situation. The guests left well after midnight. Emily helped Natalie clear the table, then sank onto the couch, feeling emotionally and physically drained. Frank, she began hesitantly, am I right in thinking that if Mark has been helping anyone, it hasn't been you? Frank sighed heavily, settling into an armchair across from her. He's been by maybe 3 times in the last few months, and only to ask for money. I thought you were all still mad at me. I've been meaning to come apologize for my behavior. I'm glad you came, Emily. Forgive this old fool. I guess I just got lonely and bitter. He gestured towards Natalie, who was busying herself in the kitchen. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone had someone, and I was all alone. Then I met Natalie and realized what an idiot I'd been, and how awful it must have been for you to hear all those things from me. Emily's head was spinning. But Mark, he's been coming home exhausted, saying he's been here taking care of you. He's been buying vitamins, medication. Frank's eyebrows shot up. Emily, I haven't seen Mark in weeks, and I certainly haven't needed any medication. I'm as healthy as a horse. Natalie excused herself to prepare a bed for Emily, and Emily stepped outside for some air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Mark. Hello? She answered, her voice trembling slightly. Em, where are you? Did you really go to Dad's? Why? Who asked you to do that? Mark's voice was sharp, angry. Mark, is that all you have to say to me? The line went silent for a moment. What do you want me to say? Mark finally spoke, his voice cold. That you're like a dull little mouse. But you cook well and can budget so we can afford everything? Or that I won't give you the apartment anyway, so you'd better not try anything and just forget about all this so we can go on living like before? What exactly do you want to hear? You know you can't do anything without me. Each of Mark's words felt like a slap in the face. Emily took a deep breath, fighting back tears. What about all the things you've said to me before? Have you been lying all this time? Em, don't start. Mark sounded exasperated. Just come home. Let's forget about this little misunderstanding. Little misunderstanding? Emily echoed incredulously. You've been lying to me for months, Mark. Where have you really been going? That's none of your business, Mark snapped. Look, we're good together, aren't we? Let's keep it that way. Besides, it's not like anyone else would want you. Emily held the phone away from her ear, then switched it off entirely. She stood there in the cool night air, feeling as if her entire world had just crumbled around her. Frank and Natalie were waiting for her inside. Mark kept calling. Emily finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she'd been holding back all evening flowing freely now. Natalie rushed to comfort her. Oh, sweetie, don't cry, she soothed, wrapping an arm around Emily's shoulders. Save your tears for those who deserve them. Frank paced back and forth, looking troubled. Oh, Mark, you fool, he muttered. What have you done? Frank and Natalie offered to let Emily stay with them. Mark didn't come by or call again. A week later, Emily filed for divorce. Frank didn't try to talk her out of it or convince her to forgive his son. He simply said she should do what she felt was right. Both he and Natalie had become closer to her in those few days than she could have ever imagined. She never would have guessed she'd find such support in her father-in-law. Emily spent the next few weeks getting her life in order. She found a small apartment, threw herself into her work, and started to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage to Mark. One evening, about a month after that fateful night, Emily parked her car and walked towards Frank and Natalie's house. She had the day off tomorrow, and she and Natalie were planning to pickle cucumbers. As she entered, she found Mark sitting on the couch. He must have arrived recently, as his conversation with Frank was in full swing. "Dad, why are you butting in?" Mark was saying, his voice angry. "What, should I have just sent Emily to you? To someone who doesn't like her and who's been lying?" Mark grimaced. "Don't exaggerate. It's not like it'll kill her. All she cares about is eating, cooking, cleaning. Let her do that." Emily cleared her throat. Mark spun around, startled. "Oh, Em, there you are," he said, his tone suddenly sweet. "I've missed you so much. Forgive me, I've been an idiot. It happens, right?" Emily stepped back as he tried to embrace her. "Did you run out of clean shirts, or is it home-cooked food you're missing?" she asked coolly. Frank burst out laughing and gave her a thumbs up. Mark's eyes narrowed. "Look who's gotten bold," he sneered. "Fine, I'll wait until you come crawling back. I might even take you back, if I feel like it." "No, Mark," Emily said firmly. "I won't be crawling back. And by the way, I'll be fighting for my half of the apartment." Mark laughed. "Go ahead and take it. Just pay me for my half. Oh, wait, you don't have a penny to your name." "That's where you're wrong," Emily replied, surprised by her own confidence. Frank gave his son a hard look. "We'll give Emily the money." "What?" Mark exploded. "Have you all lost your minds? I'm your son, and she's just some woman." Frank gently took his son by the elbow and led him towards the door. "Let's talk outside, son." As the door closed behind them, Emily sank onto the couch, feeling drained but oddly liberated. Natalie sat beside her, taking her hand. "You did good, honey," Natalie said softly. "You stood up for yourself. That's not easy, but it's important." Emily nodded, feeling a mix of emotions wash over her. "I just can't believe how much has changed in such a short time. A month ago, I thought I knew my life, my marriage. Now," Natalie squeezed her hand, "now you have a chance to build something new, something true." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes until Frank came back in, looking weary but determined. "Well, that's done," he said, settling into his armchair. "Mark's gone. I made it clear that he's not welcome here until he gets his act together." Emily looked at him in surprise. "Frank, you didn't have to do that. He's your son." Frank shook his head. "He may be my son, but that doesn't excuse his behavior. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, Emily, and one of the biggest was how I treated you when you first married Mark. I'm not about to stand by and watch him make the same mistakes I did." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Frank. You have no idea how much that means to me." 1 year later. Emily stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down her dress. She could hardly believe that a year had passed since that night at Frank's house. So much had changed, and yet, in many ways, she felt more like herself than she had in years. A knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. "Come in," she called. Natalie poked her head in, beaming. "Are you ready, sweetie? Everyone's waiting." Emily took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready." As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked with those of her soon-to-be husband, David. They had met 6 months ago at a community gardening event, and Emily had been drawn to his kind eyes and easy laugh. He looked at her with such adoration that it still took her breath away sometimes. Frank stood at the front of the small gathering, ready to give her away. As Emily reached him, he leaned in and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, kid." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When it came time for the vows, David's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "Emily, when I first met you, I was struck by your strength and your kindness. You've been through so much, and yet you still approach life with an open heart. I promise to cherish that heart, to support your dreams, and to love you more each day than I did the day before." Emily blinked back happy tears as she began her own vows. "David, you came into my life when I least expected it, but exactly when I needed you most. You've shown me what true partnership looks like. I promise to stand by your side through all of life's adventures, to be your biggest cheerleader, and to fill our home with love and laughter every single day." As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Frank and Natalie were the first to embrace the newlyweds, their faces shining with joy. At the reception, as Emily and David swayed to their first dance, she couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns her life had taken. From an unhappy marriage to a loving family she never expected to have. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Chen," David murmured, pulling her closer. Emily smiled up at him. "I was just thinking about how sometimes the most unexpected turns in life lead us exactly where we're meant to be." David nodded, his eyes twinkling. "Like a chance meeting at a community garden leading to happily ever after?" Emily laughed, remembering the day they met. Exactly like that. As the evening wore on, Emily found a quiet moment with Frank and Natalie. "Thank you both for everything," she said softly. "I don't know where I'd be without your support this past year." Frank's eyes misted over. "No need to thank us, Emily. Your family. Always have been, always will be." Natalie nodded in agreement. "We're just so happy to see you happy, dear." As David came to whisk her away for another dance, Emily felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. She had lost a husband, but gained a family. She had faced her fears and come out stronger. And most importantly, she had learned that it's never too late for a second chance at love and happiness. Looking around at the smiling faces of her friends and family, Emily knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The road had been long and sometimes painful, but it had led her here, to this moment of pure joy and love. As David twirled her on the dance floor, Emily laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had weathered the storm, and now she was dancing in the sunshine, and she couldn't wait to see what the future held.